have to say it's a real honor and for me a personal privilege to be able to introduce Ruth Reichl today. She and I were talking earlier. My mother actually was a food writer out in California, and so Ruth was sort of a household name in our house, and I grew up, always admiring her from afar. So it's a really special privilege to have this sort of personal full circle come around and for us to be here together. I don't know if any of you have been touring around the area over the weekend, but Ruth was at Buck's last night, hosted by us and James Olifanis, the owner of Buck's over on Connecticut Avenue, for a wonderful book and author dinner at Buck's. She was at the farmers market in DuPont Circle this morning, and we get to have her here in Tacoma this afternoon. So thank you for the grand tour of Washington and your short weekend here. She will be talking today about her new book. It's called My Kitchen Year, 136 Recipes That Saved My Life. I think by my count, and correct me if I'm wrong, this I think is your 7th book. Then there are 2 cookbooks for gourmet, and then 7 others, and that includes a novel, and of course, is that right? Is 7 right? Maybe I'm wrong.
7 is right,
Plus the 2 gourmet cookbooks, including a novel in that list, and of course, I'm sure many of you have read some of her other books, bestsellers, and that are really wonderful because what they do, and I think this is what sort of separates her from so many other writers, is that she so beautifully integrates memoir, food history and appreciation, cultural commentary, and then, of course, recipes. And this latest book is very much in the same vein. She also has produced food and cooking shows on PBS, which I'm sure some of you have seen. And lastly, I think you know that she's left a very broad mark on the culinary world in her career as a food critic, food editor for a major newspaper. I think you all know which one. And, of course, editor-in-chief of Gourmet Magazine for 10 years. And so I was thinking about this earlier, that with such an incredible resume and such a decades-long history in so many realms of the culinary world, that it's sort of ironic that her latest book came about because after all these incredible jobs, she was forced to wonder what she was going to do next, and that was because Gourmet Magazine very, very sadly closed, and of course it was probably the best food magazine ever. And at age 61, she had to figure out what to do next. She was without a job, and so she did what she often had done previously in her life when she was faced with adversity or challenges or something uncertain. She cooked. And she'll tell you all more about that, of course, that's why you're here. And we're delighted that joining her in conversation today will be Tim Carman of the Washington Post. Many of you know him as a food writer for the Post. He also is the author of the $20 Diner for the weekend section. And if any of you are pour-over fans, he just wrote about this crazy robotic pour-over machine at a new coffee place in Petworth that I have serious doubts about, but anyway, now you've really piqued my interest. But in any case, please join me in welcoming Ruth Reichl and Tim Carman. Thank you.
Yes, there are steps. So which one am I?
So I was told I was supposed to sit here.
Okay.
You get the rocks.
So I don't have to hold my own mic?
Well, I'm sure many food writers probably have told you this, and some may have been genuine, but this is yeah, unlike me. This is true. You are part of the reason that I wanted to get into food writing, and I was just starting to be a managing editor, and I had to edit a food section in Houston, and I was really unfamiliar with a lot of the deeper writings of food, and one of my good friends gave me, not come from me with apples, but tender as the bone, at the bone. And I read it. I sat there in the park and I read it from cover to cover, and I was like, oh, okay, I get it. This is like beautiful. It was the kind of writing that is evocative. It was personal. It made food real, and it made me appreciate what a good, talented writer could do. So I just wanted to thank you for your part in helping me become a food writer. But so this is about your book, and I wanted to ask you about you based it on your Twitter account, and you essentially kept like a journal on Twitter. And how did you decide then you were going to use that as the basis for your book?
Well, I mean, I think of this as an accidental cookbook. I mean, I didn't lose my job and say, okay, and now what I'm going to do is write a cookbook. I really thought, now, I've always said if I didn't have a day job, I would write a novel. So I started trying to write a novel, which was probably not the smartest thing to do given the emotional place that I was in. And I was really struggling with it. And I had this moment, we have these gourmet reunions, and so this was about 7 months later, and we meet, the only place that I know in New York where you can get a private room without paying for it is this kind of cheap and cheerful, do I need to bring it closer? Chinese restaurant. There's this place in Chinatown that's like got karaoke rooms that you can have for free. And one of my colleagues said, it must be really tough for you to, be in restaurants like this when you're used to being in, 3-star Michelin places. How long has it been since you didn't have an expense account? And I did the math and I said 1978. And he said, you mean since 1978 you've been able to eat in any restaurant in the world on somebody else's dime? And I said, yeah. And he said, you must really miss it. And it kind of stopped me cold because I didn't. I said, no, you know what? I have loved cooking. I haven't even thought about the fact that I haven't been going to restaurants. I've loved every minute I've spent in the kitchen. And he said, for as long as I've known you, you've said your mission in life was to get people back into the kitchen. Maybe you should write about this experience. And so I backed into it, and the only way I really knew what I had been doing, and I don't keep a journal anymore, but I had my tweets, and I'd been tweeting every day, so I knew what I was doing and thinking every day. And as I'd been cooking, when I came up with a recipe that worked, I sort of wrote it down so I could replicate it. So the tweets they were like my journal because I had been sending them out into the world. So it just seemed natural to me to incorporate them into the book.
And it's interesting because it's a journal that's a very public thing. It's like a journal that you keep unlocked and let everyone in the world read. Did you actually keep another journal then of more private thoughts, or was this it?
This is it. So I really needed the tweets to know what I was thinking and what I was doing. But, I tried, for the longest time, when I first started tweeting, I was just thinking I was tweeting to my friends. And my notion was every day I will try and make a little snapshot of a moment in my life. And it wasn't until Gourmet closed that it occurred to me that people other than my friends were reading them. I mean, I didn't think of it as that public. And then Gourmet closed and there was this outpouring of support from the Twitter community, which made me feel like I had all these virtual friends. It was very comforting. Mm-hmm. And, as I said, I think in Tender at the Bone, I think privacy is really overrated. Huh. I think, the notion of privacy is that we're all so different. And I think, you scratch the surface and we're all pretty much the same. So I've never had any problem with sort of putting it out there.
Well, you had to make a decision when Gourmet closed to whether you're going to live in upstate New York or New York, and you and your husband picked upstate New York. Do you think that played into how the tone and the nature of this book, like the environment itself, it would have been different had it been in New York City?
I think there's no question. And the truth is, it probably, we had never spent a winter up there. And we have a house in very rural New York on top of a mountain. It's very isolated. At that, we now have a backup generator. We didn't then. And so, I mean, and it was a really harsh winter. I mean, probably moving up there was not the smartest thing we ever did in our lives. But we lent our apartment to someone else, so we couldn't go back into the city for a few months. And we were up there, and literally there would be 3 and 4 days at a time when we could not leave. Where, I mean, at one point it was snowing an inch an hour, and you couldn't even open the door because the drifts were so heavy, and the snowplows couldn't get up, and then the electricity went out. And so we were truly living with nature in a way that urban people don't ever really experience, you know, where you have no electricity, so you're pretty much living with the light in winter. I mean, you're getting up late, going to, you know, the light is gone at 5 o'clock. You're lighting a fire. By 7 o'clock, you're ready to go to bed. So, I mean, the seasonality of this book was very much dictated by the fact that we were up there.
What, for someone who thinks privacy is overrated, you must have had a lot of it during that period.
We did. Too much for my taste. And again, it's one of the places where Twitter became so important to me because when the electricity would first go out, my phone would still be working, and so I could tweet. And one of the things I missed most about Gourmet is we had 8 connected test kitchens and 12 full-time cooks. And one of the great joys of being at the magazine was you could go to the kitchens and be in the middle of passionate arguments about food. Yeah, I put some of that into Delicious. I mean, the scenes in the test kitchen are absolutely taken from Gourmet. And I missed those arguments where, you know, people would be, you know, fiercely debating whether you needed another onion in this dish or it should be cooked, you know, at 25 degrees lower or in a bigger pan. And one day, you know, I tweeted, I had just mixed up a batch of bread dough and the power went out. And I tweeted, what should I do with this dough? I mean, I may not have an oven for 4 days. And everybody tweeted back at me, keep punching it down, keep punching it down. And then the minute the electricity went on and I had an oven again, you know, people started saying, so, you know, how's the bread? And I realized, and it was the best bread I've ever made. I mean, it was like a real lesson to me that, in fact, when you keep punching it down for days, what's happening is all the wild yeasts come and you get a bread of much more character and complexity, and it doesn't stale the way, I mean, I couldn't believe, you know, 3 days later, it was still not stale. And it's this kind of bread that's normally stale after a day. And I realized I had a community of cooks like Gourmet, but it was a Twitter community. And I did the same with bananas. I mean, one day I was up there with nothing but 2 bananas, and I said, you know, I haven't made banana bread in years. What should I do with these bananas? And literally people from all over the world started sending me recipes for what to do with these bananas. And so I kind of fell in love with Twitter over that time. I mean, it really made me feel like I was not alone up on my mountaintop. I mean, it's very different to be alone in your kitchen and to have this community of cooks at your back that you can ask a question at any point.
Yeah, the banana bread anecdote is hilarious because I don't know how many recommendations you got, but then you went back to your old favorite recipe anyway.
Yeah, well, it was just overwhelming. I mean, as I say in the book, I mean, it turns out the banana bread is like the kitchen sink of recipes. There is no ingredient that somebody somewhere doesn't put into banana bread. And after, you know, put in like rum, coffee, coconut, coco loco, apricot. I suddenly thought, you know what, this is too much trouble. I'm just going to make the one I've been making since I was 10.
That's hilarious. Well, one of the reasons why I think this cookbook is just charming is that you take a very personalized approach to recipe writing, and you allow a lot of flexibility. There's some things that you don't even give measurements for. You like use as many onions as you like, you know.
You can never use too many onions in a stew. It's not possible.
There's phrases that are so kind of different from the way I think a lot of publishers now put out cookbooks, where they want everything to be precise because they're always so worried that the recipe is not going to turn out. And you take almost like the opposite approach, and you use things like, there was a couple I wrote down, like we were talking about worrying the anchovies in the pan. I'm like, oh, I could imagine an editor just saying, "What do you mean, Ruth? Worrying the anchovies?" But it's really personal, and I really like it, and I don't know how much pushback you got on that.
Well, I was so persuaded that I was going to get pushed. I mean, I really wanted this to be conversational. I really wanted, one, for it to feel like we were cooking together, and two, that you would make the recipe your own rather than, I do think we think way too much in this country of recipes being like prescriptions, marching orders. You must do it this way. If you don't have an ingredient, don't bother making it. And, my feeling, a little of this, a little of that, fudge it a little. That's the kind of cook I am. And I also sort of have this feeling of we demand perfection in a way, and we've made people feel like if they're going to make something that isn't perfect, they shouldn't do it at all. And I think that's a crazy attitude. So I really wanted to write them this way, but I was so persuaded that Random House was going to say, "You can't do this," that when I hired someone to test the recipes, and I said, and while you're testing them, will you put them into classic, an ingredient list with steps 1, 2, 3, 4, just in case Random House gets ugly about it. And so I have them. I have the classic style of recipe. And when I said to my editor, and if you really insist, and she looked at me and she said, "Why would we do that? This is great."
Yeah. Well, I loved it. And I wanted to ask, it's like, you talk about so much in the book and the narrative of the book, which almost reads like a novel. You talked about you wanted to write a novel, and it almost has that sort of novelistic feeling of building up to your dealing with the closure of Gourmet. And I wondered if that was on purpose, if you were trying to lead us down that path.
Yeah, I really wanted this to have a narrative arc. It was important to me that this be a book that was not just a cookbook, but to me, cooking is a journey, but it's also, in some ways, a metaphor. I wanted this book to be useful to people who might not be cooks, and that, part of what I'm hoping that people will get out of it is cooking is my passion, but maybe sewing is your passion, or singing, or painting. And part of what this book is about doing something that you really care about when you're in trouble, and learning not to define yourself through your job. The thing that happened to me was, when the first morning I was really without a job, and I woke up and I really felt like I don't know who I am. I've always been Ruth Reichl, something. Editor, writer, restaurant critic. And now I'm Ruth Reichl, nothing. And I think that, especially in the environment that we have in America today, where increasingly jobs are not secure, more and more people find themselves in that place. And I wanted this also to be a book about don't define yourself by your work, and there's a way to find your center And that, for me is what this book is about. And the first comment I got about the book was after the first day that the galleys went out, the bound galleys went out last spring. And I got a note from somebody who said, I'm the assistant to the editor of a major magazine, and your galleys came across my desk today, and I'm in such a bad place emotionally, and I read this book all day, and it just really meant so much to me. And he said, and then I went home and read it again tonight, and I've just finished it for the second time, and I just want you to know that you've given me hope. And I thought, yes, that's what I wanted to do.
Well, and it sounds like you were coming at this year a couple years removed, and I wondered if that brought up different emotions than what you had the first time around, like rethinking of all the closure and the dealing with the emotional fallout.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I could have written it in real time. It's one thing to write it while you're going through it, and it's another thing to write it at the point where you have come through it and you're okay. So, writing the book wasn't cathartic. I mean, actually living the book was cathartic, and writing it was really, you must know this. I mean, I hate to write. I will do anything rather than write, anything. I'll find a million, I'll clean the house, anything.
Cleaning the bathroom starts looking good.
Yeah, exactly. And, people always say to me, oh, your books just read like you just sat down and wrote them. Every word in every book I've ever written was rewritten 5 or 10 times, except this book, which this book almost wrote itself. I mean, it just happened. I don't expect I'll ever have this experience again, but I pretty much knew what I wanted to do and just sat down and did it.
Well, let's open it up to some questions. I'm sure there are many questions. We've got about 20 minutes left with Ruth, and I don't want to monopolize all the questions.
Did you ever write poetry? Sorry, put me on the spot. Because your writing is very poetic and lyrical. When you write about food, did you ever study poetry or
Never.
So what recommendation for someone if someone were going into food writing? How does one write about food the way you do? I mean, because it seems very sensual, very evocative.
When I first started writing restaurant reviews, I thought all the restaurant reviews that I had ever read were really boring. They were consumer reports. This has too much salt, and that doesn't tell the reader anything. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how, given the very limited vocabulary we have in English for flavor and taste, how I could make people taste the food that I was writing about. And I very quickly got to the place where I realized you have to be able to describe it beyond flavor. And so I worked really hard in the early years to, use every sensory term I could use. Weather, aroma, walking in the woods. I mean, just pulling in everything I could to try and make people experience the food the way I was experiencing it. And I mean, the difficult thing about writing about food is, somebody who's writing a book review knows that the readers are going to read the same book that they read. And if you're doing a film review, they're going to see the same film. we have no way of knowing. We don't really understand taste. We know that taste is mostly aroma, but we don't know how smell works. We still don't physically know how smell works. And we really don't know whether any two of us taste the same thing. And so as a writer, you're in this odd place where you're talking about something that's going on in your mouth and you have no idea whether any of your readers will in fact experience that in the same way. So you really have to try and bring everything you have to the writing of that. And I don't think there's any other kind of writing that's quite like that. Yeah.
Well, I know that you were an editor for 10 years. I'm wondering how long were you a restaurant critic, and out of those two jobs, which ones did you like better?
I was a restaurant critic for 10 years at the LA Times, 6 years before that at New West, 6 years at the New York Times, so a long time. But I was also, at the LA Times, I was also the editor of the food section there, and had the great joy of transforming that food section, which I then pretty much repeated at Gourmet. I mean, it was why I was hired at Gourmet, because they knew what I had done at the LA Times in that food section. And being a restaurant critic is enormous fun. If anybody who tells you that it's not a great job is just lying, because it's, you get to take all your friends out to eat, but I really believe that food is important, and I really felt as an editor that you get to bring so many other people's talents into what you're doing, and you get to speak to a much broader audience, and that I got to be both a food editor at the LA Times and the editor of Gourmet at really important points in American food history when there was really a lot to talk about, and there still is today, when our entire food system is being, so troubled. And the rewards of, giving people good information to make smart food choices is much more rewarding to me than being a restaurant critic. It's not as much fun, maybe, but it's certainly it feels really important. And I really loved that.
So when you were a writer and an editor, did you have words that you banished yourself or others from ever using?
Yes, my staff at Gourmet had a whole list of, words Ruth hates. Yummy is one of them. Eatery is one of them. Yummy is one. You do not never
Definitely
describe. Very high on my list of words you don't use. Eatery is another one. I just loathe that word. I can't remember. Anybody in my staff could probably give you a better, a very long list of things I hate.
I have a question. I'm a nutritionist, and I rarely see people with health-related conditions related to food and their diet and nutrition who cook. Almost inevitably, people with nutritional problems, especially after they reach a certain age, don't cook. And I'm just wondering, in your experience, if you have any ideas of how to inspire some of these self-described non-cooks to cook.
Well, one of the things that I really want to do in this book is to, I truly believe that cooking is what...
Is that me?
I don't know. It's one of us. I think cooking is man's natural activity. It's what we do. And if you ever spend time with children and you see what joy they get in the kitchen, you really understand that it's what we're meant to do. There's a whole argument that Richard Wrangham has made about how cooking is in fact what made us human. And I think that one of the things we in the media have done, which is so pernicious, is we've made people feel that cooking is hard. It's not. And cooking is really easy. And part of what you do is you start with simple things. You know, I mean, I really think that we've terrified people into thinking they have to be chefs. And, you know, so I mean, like, one of the things I'm doing now is my son is in graduate school. And, you know, I'm giving him a bunch of recipes that I have promised him are quicker than ordering in. You know, they take like 3 or 4 ingredients that are very simple. And I think that we need one, you know, to persuade people that they can do really simple food. And the other thing I think is that when people say they can't cook, what they really mean is they can't shop. Because the shopping is probably, if you shop on the weekend and know what you're going to cook during the week, half your problem is over. You know, if you've planned out your meals and you've got the food in your house. And I do think that, you know, there are all these new systems like Blue Apron and so forth that will deliver to your house pre-measured exactly what you need with the directions to make a dish. And I think that those things are in fact going to persuade people that cooking isn't that hard. I'm hopeful.
So, in some level, isn't it sort of a media problem in that every Thanksgiving, food sections across the country have to come up with new ways to write about Thanksgiving? Instead of just saying, you know what, the easiest way to roast a turkey is just put that thing in an oven, high heat, get it done with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, one of the stories in this book is about Thanksgiving, and and I have a high heat turkey recipe in this, but as a food editor at both Gourmet and the LA Times, like every year, it's like, how are we going to make a new and different turkey? And one year at the LA Times, I persuaded the entire city of Los Angeles to stuff the stuffing beneath the skin of the turkey. No sane person would do it a second time. I mean, it's completely crazy. But, you know, you run out of ideas and you start looking for, you know, swell new ways to cook a turkey.
Other questions?
Hi. When I think about an editor in New York, I think about somehow you seem like a really nice, not hard-edged kind of person. And coming into a magazine like Gourmet, where there's already a big established staff, how would you describe like how you do that and what your executive style was?
I mean, I'm writing that memoir now. I mean, I am truly the last person who should ever have been at a place like Condé Nast. You know, I mean, I was a subway person. It's a very princess job. I mean, there are editors at Condé Nast who have literally never been on the subway in their lives. I had a clothing allowance, I had a driver, hair and makeup people show up at your house every morning. But I always was aware that I was only a visitor in that land and that I better not ever think that that was real life. And unlike, I think, every other editor at Condé Nast, and one of the great things about Condé Nast is they do let you run your magazine your way. And I went in, and they had always edited from the top down. They had no meetings ever. And the 3 top editors sort of told everybody what they were going to do. And I went in and said, that's over. I'm not running this magazine. We're running this magazine. And my basic philosophy is you hire people who are smarter than you are, and you let them do what they do best. So I wouldn't have dreamed of telling my creative director, how to do his job. I mean, I hired him because he was brilliant. My executive editor was a much better manager than I am, so I let him manage. I never wrote a memo without showing it to the managing editor first, because he was just much better. You know, he would look at me and say, you could probably tone it down a little, or you could be a little tougher, you know. And I basically went in the first week to this staff that had literally never had a meeting, called a meeting. There wasn't a room big enough in our old offices to have a meeting. We were all sitting around on the floor. And I said, you know, look, we can do anything we want. And I was prepared to talk myself for 3 hours, because I didn't think, because they never had meetings, I thought they would not be prepared to have a discussion. And I said, we can do anything we want, any ideas, and I didn't open my mouth again for 3 hours. I mean, they had great ideas, and they were the ones who said, you know, we've got to do a farm issue. We've got to talk about, you know, real issues on the farm. What if we did a pro and con about genetic modification? I mean, they were just hungry to tackle real issues. So it was fantastic. And, you know, I mean, most of the great things we did were not my ideas, they were their ideas.
Some of those issues you just mentioned and the food system challenges you talked about before, what do you think are the most critical things we need to fix in our food system?
What are the most critical things we need to fix in our food system? There are so many. It's really hard to begin. You know, one of the biggest problems we have is that we've had this stick held over our head about, you know, the need to that we need to have transgenic foods because we need to feed the future. I mean, the truth is that we waste globally 50% of all the food that we produce. And so one of the big needs we have is to figure out better ways of distributing food and not wasting food. I mean, that's a huge. Water is like a big issue, going to be a bigger issue. You know, I mean, nobody quite understands yet what the drought on the West Coast is going to mean for our food system. It's going to be enormous. We're only beginning to see what that means. Farmers are pressed in ways that most people don't really understand. I mean, most of the farms that actually feed us, as opposed to the ones that raise industrial products, you know, I mean, the farms that we hear about that get the big subsidies are raising soy and corn to feed animals, basically. But the farmers that feed us are around cities. They're around urban areas, and their land has become so valuable that we're losing farmland at an extraordinary rate. And young, you know, people who are like fifth generation in farm families, it's very tempting to sell your land because it's so valuable now. I mean, we're losing farms at a frightening rate. Those are, you know, and probably the biggest problem I think we have is we are all patting ourselves on the back about how sustainable our food system, you know, we who care about food and eat food that, you know, has been picked by angels and has never been touched by pesticides. The entire American food system runs on the backs of undocumented workers who are terribly exploited, continue to be exploited, and we won't have a sustainable food system until we fix that. And farm workers and meat packers and dishwashers are fairly paid. And that's just a little bit of the problems that we have.
Well, I think you even hired Barry Estabrook to write about tomato pickers when you read Gourmet. I think that was predating Tomatoland.
It was, yes. It's one of the prouder things I've done. I mean, Barry's work is fantastic. And the thing is that, you know, he did this piece about how the people who pick tomatoes in Florida at that time were slaves. and he used the word virtual, and the sheriff in Immokalee said, get the word virtual out of there. They are slaves. And, one of the things that I have learned, I do a lot of speaking for a group called the Rural and Migrant Ministry in New York, and, it's very comforting to think all those people are in Florida, but they aren't. 20 miles from where I live in upstate New York are people who are farm workers who live in terrible conditions. It's a problem.
So,
Let's end on a high note. Come on.
oh. Well, I'm not going to lighten it up. I'm sorry. So you are in Washington D.C., or you're in? Yeah, we're in Tacoma. So obviously, one of the issues of the First Lady is obesity, and I'm wondering, like, as you as one of the most prominent food writers in the country, how do you deal with this idea of glamorizing food, but helping people not eat so much? I mean, we've got a real serious issue, and it's going to get worse, and it's going to affect our healthcare business. It's already affecting military readiness. It's affecting many different parts of the American society, and I'm wondering, like, how much of it is this sort of romanticization of food helping or not helping, or is there some role that food writers can play in this?
Well, I think it's a mistake to think of it as people, obese people overeat. I don't think you want to demonize the eaters. I mean, the truth is that the industrialized food is horrible for people. And we have a tax system that has made junk cheaper than food. It's crazy. We subsidize sugar, we subsidize corn, and we overproduce calories, so we're like stuffing people to use the excess calories. And one of the ways you fix that is you glamorize real food as opposed to junk food. And one of the first things I would do to fix that problem is to stop allowing big food companies to advertise to children. These kids sit in front of the TV. They have no way to make real choices, and eating is learned behavior, and we are teaching little children to eat stuff that's bad for them. We are essentially teaching people to poison themselves, and we should stop. And that would be my first step in that.
It's interesting because, I think the Obama administration tried to go after children's advertising, and they realized they couldn't. It's a First Amendment right to be able to advertise whenever, wherever they want, so they did the voluntary agreements, which I think, as we all know, doesn't quite work.
But here's the thing. This is what I love so much about food. Consumer pressure actually works. What we have seen is Purdue buy Nyman Ranch. They did not buy Nyman Ranch because they had a sudden crisis of consciousness about the mistreatment of animals. They did it because the American public said, we really don't want to eat tortured animals. And, we as consumers can say to the food companies, we will not buy your products if you continue to do this, and they will stop. We vote with our dollars, and we have to start using that power. And, it's why I think food is so interesting. It's hard to change the government, but a little bit of pressure sways these food companies really quickly.
How do you look at this idea that locally sourced food, sustainable food is an elitist sort of thing, and that it's not for everyone, that not everyone can afford to eat healthful food?
Well, I think that's where learning to cook comes into the equation, because the way we cook is, the easiest way to cook is to throw a piece of protein on the grill, right? But it's an expensive way to cook. If you know how to cook vegetables, which is more time consuming, if you know how to balance protein to, use rice and beans, it stops being an elitist issue. It is an elitist issue if you insist on having meat be at the center of your plate 3 times a day. I mean, I just think we have to, throw that away. I mean, the truth is that decent food should be a right, not a privilege. It's absurd to think of that as an elitist issue.
You talk about water usage, it's huge with cattle.
Yes, and methane. I mean, climate change. I mean, they're the biggest source of methane in the world. And
Other questions?
We have time for one more question.
I think that all these things are really important that we've been talking about, and it would take weeks and weeks to come up with some better ideas of the paths we're pursuing. But as long as we have you on the stage and you've had the career that you've had, going towards a lighter note and being a restaurant critic, what was one sort of thing that stood out from you? Did you have a really hysterical or terrible experience at a restaurant or at the time when you were the food critic? Because you got to see and experience so much. And one of the delightful things about you is to be able to find out some of the backstory.
okay, before I answer this question, how many people have read Garlic and Sapphires? Okay, so I won't tell my favorite stories, which are all in Garlic and Sapphires. But I will tell you, so as a food critic, I disguised myself and made myself into many characters. And that's what Garlic and Sapphires is about. But I didn't put all of my characters into the books. And one of the characters I didn't put into the book was someone who was called Stella. And Stella was a very brassy blonde. And I bought, those things that pad you in. So she was, and she wore very tight clothes. And Stella went once to one of those Upper East Side restaurants that is, frequented by the elite of the elite. And they were kind of horrified to see Stella walk in. And it's one of those places where, they come up to the table and show you a basket of things that are not on the menu. And today we have the white truffles and so forth. Trying to upsell you to something that's even more expensive than their already ludicrous prices. And one of the things that the waiter brought out was a striped bass. And Stella said, is that wild or farmed? And the waiter said, I don't know. I'll find out. And he went into the kitchen and he came back and he said this. And I know that he actually said this, that I haven't hallucinated it, because I put it in the review in the New York Times, and I would not have if he had not actually said this. But he came out and he said, it's a wild fish. It was caught very near where you're from, Coney Island. And I was horrified, because my basic belief about fancy restaurants is that no matter who you are or what you look like, when you go into a restaurant, there's an unwritten contract. And, the contract is that they will, for a few hours, give you the illusion that you are a wealthy person who is, has servants and is being beautifully treated. And I was so outraged that they would treat someone like that I put it in the review. And the restaurant was horrified. So that's a good note.
Well, what
That's a good note.
I have to ask, Ruth Bourdain.
Tony and I both thought it was hilarious, and we were both flattered by it. And I was kind of sorry when Ruth Bourdain faded into the sunset.
Ruth, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.